Okay, this sucks. Okay, I did not move to Southern California to get rained on. It's December 2019, and this is the third time it's happened this year. Okay, so the weather sucks. Can't get too much done in the yard today. So this is probably a perfect day to talk about something else that sucks. So what is the biggest problem with reclaimed wood? Are we talking hidden nails, bugs, theft, moisture problems, metal, hidden nails, general lack of supply? Well, all of those could be considered big problems, but there's one huge problem that nobody wants to talk about. So let's talk about it. I floated this topic out to a couple of major publications in the woodworking world, and it was interesting. The response I got was basically, I thought, hey, this is a great topic. I've never heard anybody talk about it before, and it's one of these unicorn of a topics where you come up with this idea and you're like, someone must have written something significant about this topic before. But I checked around, I could find nothing in a Google search, I could find nothing in any trade publications, or just very, maybe topical, just very superficial discussions of the issue, but nothing that really delved deep. So I thought, well, hey, this is a great idea, and who's better to write a piece like this than someone in the lumber industry? I've had 25 plus years in the lumber industry, so I figured myself to be somewhat qualified to write a piece like that. But again, the response was crickets. Then I started to think, well, why? Why does no one care to delve into this topic? Well, because if you are a woodworking magazine, especially in these tough times to be a media company of any sort, basically your revenue comes from advertisers. Advertisers are your wood sellers, people in the wood industry. And a lot of these people in the wood industry sell reclaimed wood. It is a huge, huge market right now. It's probably the fastest growing segment of the woodworking industry in general. Then I thought about why. Well, why would these major publications not get back to me on such a juicy topic that has to be of interest to just about all of their readers? Well, where do the magazines get their money from? Advertisers. Who is advertising? Well, a lot of them are wood sellers, and a lot of them sell reclaimed wood, and a lot of them don't want to know about a problem that may affect their sales. So this may piss off some of my friends in the industry and some suppliers and maybe friends and customers alike, but if it makes the lumber industry more trustworthy and it makes consumers further protected, then in the long run it is a good thing. So what is this one huge problem with the reclaimed wood market that nobody wants to talk about? Reclaimed wood fraud. You heard it here first. That's right, people buying reclaimed wood that think it is one thing when it's really another thing entirely. And I'm going to tell you why I think that's a huge problem. When I first started delving into this issue, I said, well, what would be a better place to start than Google? I Googled how to identify reclaimed wood. How many results do you think came up? Would you believe zero? Zero, no results. Let me back up a bit. There were results, but absolutely none of them I told you how to identify reclaimed, whether wood is reclaimed or not. All of them focused on the species of what the reclaimed wood is. So whether it's white oak or red oak or pine, all of them focused on what species the wood is. But none of them addressed whether or not the wood itself was reclaimed. Okay, so I found that a little bit troubling. Then I said, well, maybe roll it back a little bit. Let's start with the absolute basics. What is reclaimed wood? Okay, so say for example, somebody buys an IKEA nightstand, and rather than assembling it, they take the parts out of the box and slightly modify it to create a serving tray. That, my friends, is reclaimed. Just like your 18th century wall paneling. Same thing. So do you see where I'm going with this? They both fall under the umbrella of reclaimed. Now, I know what you're thinking. Anybody familiar with the lumber industry knows that a lumber rep's word is a sacred bond. Right? Now, the lumber industry is no worse than any other industry, but unfortunately, it has its share of lazy profiteers. And laziness plus lack of morals often leads to bad things. In short, it's really tempting to put something in the reclaimed category that really, you're either pushing the margins of what. In short, it's really tempting to want to sell something reclaimed versus just regular wood. Why? Because the margins are huge on reclaimed wood. And in non-reclaimed wood, they are ordinary. Well, let's say, for example, say I have a used oak entryway door and I want to sell it. So I go on Craigslist and sell it. Well, let's say maybe I'll ask $250. A door, it costs a certain amount of money, new, and it's been beaten up over time. It's used now and worth less. So you price it what you think it's going to sell for and hope someone buys it. But you're also competing with thousands of other oak entry doors that are probably on Craigslist and Facebook selling groups everywhere. There's lots of competition. However, if you have an oak entry door that was from the early 1900s, reclaimed from a farmhouse in Missouri, you may well have the only one on the market. So not only do you have a fascinating story that tends to suck people in much different way than a Craigslist ad would suck someone in, but you also have exclusivity. You aren't competing with thousands of other people on Craigslist. You have the one door with that story. Zero competition. Reclaimed lumber is probably one of the only SKUs in the lumber industry that you can just slap a label on something and have it worth substantially more than it would be worth without the label. About 15 years ago, there was a big push to get a lot of lumber companies on with the FSC program, Forest Stewardship Council. Most companies came to the conclusion it was nice to have a stamp that said, hey, this material you have here has been certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, but really no one was willing to pay a lot more for that privilege. All things being equal, consumers would rather have FSC wood than not, but they weren't really willing to pay any kind of a premium for it. Now, you compare that with reclaimed. People will pay huge amounts of money for reclaimed wood with interesting stories. And so you can see the potential for abuse. Literally, you can take junk and turn it into a high margin product. When you're talking about traditional hardwood lumber sales, you cannot take a board with 6 knots in it and call it FAS, or what would be first and second, the highest lumber grade, because there is a very specific grade put out by the National Hardwood Lumber Association definition that tells how clear that board has to be. Now there's some mills, maybe they push it a little bit, but it's all within a pretty narrow spectrum. You cannot take a pine board and say, hey, this is mahogany. Anyone with even a small amount of hardwood lumber experience or woodworking experience would sniff that out in a second and walk away from that deal. That's not going to happen. However, when you put reclaimed on something, well, that's different. How do you verify that? Occasionally you'll get wood sellers pushing the envelope in the way of a grade, maybe including some lower grade with their upper grade, but we're talking about a slight pushing of the envelope, not a complete recategorization of the product. Along the same lines, a few years ago, I had about $1,500 worth of mahogany lumber that was taken out of my yard and never paid for. Subsequently, I saw this lumber listed online as old growth mahogany and being sold on eBay at a pretty large markup. And I recognized the lumber. I knew the guy that took it. He took a product that he bought for nothing and resold it at a very high margin simply by adding that old growth label to it. There's not a lot of people doing this in the industry, but it's very easy for hucksters to get away with it when it comes to something like just adding a label to a product like old growth or reclaimed. A few years ago, I walked into a lumber company and I saw a lot of reclaimed fencing being sold. So, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. But when I took a closer look, it wasn't all that interesting. Basically, the fencing looked pretty similar from fence post to fence post, from fence to fence, from plank to plank. It's like, okay, well, I talked to someone about it and they said, well, you know, it's selling like hotcakes. Okay, well, that's good. Part of the burgeoning reclaimed lumber market, I suppose. But then he pulls me aside and says, well, you know what they're doing, don't you? The company was installing fence in the ground for about 3 months, letting it get weathered, uninstalling the fence, and then selling it as reclaimed fencing. Is that a dishonest thing to do? I don't know. Going by the definition we use of reclaimed wood, I don't think it is, scarily enough. But I'm sure that's not what people had in mind when they think they're buying reclaimed fencing. For all intensive purposes, there's no difference between artificial reclaimed and real reclaimed. So here's a countdown of my 4 major issues with reclaimed wood. Number 4, it's often extremely difficult or expensive to prove something is actually reclaimed. How do you go about doing that? Who exactly is in a position to call out a fake reclaimed wood product? You can carbon date it, I suppose, but that doesn't tell you. It only tells you an idea of how old it is. It doesn't tell you what it was used for. And keep in mind, there's a limit to how much anyone would actually spend to try and prove this. I mean, we're not talking about a fake Rembrandt here. Any fraud that takes place with reclaimed wood, we're talking about 4 or 5 figure fraud, not million or multi-million dollar frauds like you see in the art world. Number 3, almost anything can qualify as reclaimed based on the loose definition that the marketplace uses right now. Number 2, a combination of extremely high margins and loose oversight is a breeding ground for fraud or generally deceptive business practices. Number 1, the biggest problem with the reclaimed wood market is that nobody wants to know if there's a problem with the wood. The homeowners, the wood sellers, the people doing the demo work, all of them have a vested interest in the story being good, interesting, and true. So no one has an incentive to really find out if it's not true. Everyone is vested in the romance of the reclaimed story, regardless of its authenticity. The homeowner wants a story to tell his or her friends over wine and cheese. The wood seller likes the really high margins and the exclusivity of selling wood product that no one else has. Demolition companies get more money for selling items with interesting provenances than dull ones. So as a veteran of the lumber industry, a 25-year veteran of the lumber industry, what do I recommend that you do if you're looking to make sure that you're protected against buying fake reclaimed wood? I wish I could give you an ironclad way to avoid being taken advantage of or ripped off, but I can't. It's very difficult. My recommendation, deal with companies that you know and trust and have a high profile. If somebody who has a reputation in the industry is much less likely to try to pull the wool over someone's eyes, and they're much more likely to do their due diligence than a random ad in Craigslist. Here's the other thing I would recommend. If you're going to pay a premium for a reclaimed item, let's say you pay $1,000 for a reclaimed wood door that you probably would only pay $300 for if it didn't have some great story attached to it. Well, it's time to start doing some research and asking some questions. Get as much of the story as possible. And when I say get as much of the story, I don't mean the romantic story that made you want to buy this item. I mean get the details. Get particulars on the background. Where did it come from? When was it reclaimed? Who did the demo work? Do you have any paperwork, etc.? The answer is just trust us. Well, I wouldn't. People have made fortunes doing fraudulent productions of vintage wines. Talking millions of dollars. The Getty Center itself was swindled. They spent almost $9 million back when Ronald Reagan was president on the Corcos, but basically a statue, and it proved to be a fake, a reproduction. Artsy editorial. Getty Koros removed from view. Museum officials deem it a forgery. Getty was so proud of this purchase that they even installed a special earthquake-proofing system just to protect this one very valuable asset, which turned out to be a fake. You can bet an organization like the Getty Center, which had a cadre of experts that were vetting these purchases, if the Getty Center, which cost almost $1 billion to create, falls victim to scams, how confident do you feel making your purchases?